Ani, hello everyone, and welcome today to today's webinar, Dispelling EV Myths. My name is Benjamin John, and I'm the Climate and Energy Programs Manager for the Georgian Bay Mnidoo Gamii Biosphere, as well as your facilitator for today. Also joining me from the Biosphere is Allison Covert, our Climate and Energy Programs Coordinator, who will be leading all of the tech in the background. So if you're having any issues with Zoom, Allison will be able to help you. Please know that we will be recording today's session. We want to make sure that it's accessible to those that weren't able to make it today, and also offer you the opportunity to review any of the topics that were discussed. This link to the webinar will be circulated in a follow-up afterwards, and it will also be made available on our website at a later date. We also encourage you and welcome you to use the question and answer tool that Zoom offers. If you have a question at any time in the webinar, please put it in there, and we will leave some time at the end for some questions to make sure that they're answered. And before we begin today, I'd also like to take this moment to acknowledge the land on which we're on today. The Georgian Bay Biosphere is situated within the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and the Williams Treaty of 1920 and located on Anishinaabeg territory. Our organization under UNESCO acknowledges the rights of Indigenous peoples in this territory and works towards respectful and reciprocal relationships as we are all caretakers of the land. Once again, thank you all for joining us this evening. If this is your first time hearing about the Georgian Bay Mnidoo Gamii Biosphere, we are one of 19 UNESCO World Biospheres located in Canada. Our biosphere stretches 200 kilometers along the eastern coast of Georgian Bay and was designated by UNESCO back in 2004. And our region is ecologically unique as it contains the largest freshwater archipelago or series of freshwater islands on Earth. As an organization, we are a registered charity with an office located in Parry Sound, Ontario, and we rely on grants, partnerships, and donations to carry out our work in the fields of environmental conservation, climate action, sustainable communities, culture, and education. It's our goal to help inform, educate, facilitate, and provide leadership within these areas as a way to inspire collaborative partnerships for learning and action, and work towards building a balance between humans and nature within the Georgian Bay Biosphere region. I'm really excited to share with you that today's webinar is part of a larger webinar series as well as project focused on electric vehicles. We've had a few webinars in the past, and we have a few webinars coming up in the future as well as today. And we'd like to thank the Mike Brigham Foundation, as well as Lakeland Solutions, the North Bay Parry Sound District Health Unit, as well as some of our other partners who have made this possible. If you enjoy this webinar today, I highly encourage you to head over to gbbr.ca/events and register for some of the upcoming webinars, as well as future events that we have in store. We have some great speakers lined up, and whether you're an EV expert already, you have some knowledge already, or just beginning to learn about EVs, there's going to be something for everyone. The Georgian Bay Biosphere will also be holding a sustainable transportation event on August 19th in Parry Sound at the Stocky Center, where you can actually test drive different models of electric vehicles as well as e-bikes. You'll be able to interact with EV chargers and ask experts and owners any questions that you might have about these technologies. If you're interested in attending or learning more about either of these events, please also feel free to and welcome to reach out to me after today's session. And before we begin, I'd also like to start by putting a question out to everyone. I'm interested to know if you have any concerns about EVs, and if you do, what some of those concerns might be. We may have in the past seen some messaging that perhaps EVs don't work in the cold, that they may not actually be a green alternative, that they may crash the grid. And there's some others that are out there as well too. So in a moment, you should see a question and some responses show up on your screen. And there they are. And feel free to select as many options as you like. But again, we're looking for which of these common EV concerns are you worried about? And I'll just give everyone maybe 30 seconds or so to submit their responses. Just give Rowan 10 more seconds to submit those responses. It looks like there is some quite common themes. Allison, I'm not sure if you're able to share those responses with everybody, but what I'm seeing on my end is that the two biggest concerns are that EVs are more expensive than gas vehicles, that they don't have enough range to meet driving needs, and then secondly, we're seeing that there's concerns that EVs aren't actually a green alternative, and that EVs will crash the electrical grid. And fortunately, I'm quite confident that today in our presentation that we'll be able to address a lot of these concerns that are out there. Thank you, Allison. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce you all today to our guest speaker, Jeff Turner, Director of Clean Mobility at Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. Jeff's passion for clean mobility and advanced energy technologies has led to a career at the nexus of sustainable transportation, energy storage, demand response, and renewable energy. His experience, more than a decade working with vehicle manufacturers, research institutes, utilities, and governments, affords him a unique and grounded perspective on what is needed to move the needle on market adoption of clean energy technologies. Jeff's work has covered personal and commercial vehicle engineering, EV charging infrastructure, energy storage technology, vehicle grid integration, demand response, among many others. Jeff is a recognized leader in transportation electrification and currently serves on the board of Electric Mobility Canada. And prior to joining Dunsky, Jeff worked at PowerTech Labs, which is a subsidiary of BC Hydro, where he led EV charging infrastructure initiatives and supported EV adoption within corporate and government fleets, and contributed to the development of utility and government programs and policies. I've had the pleasure with working with Jeff on a clean mobility project in the past, and I can tell you today that we're incredibly fortunate to have his expertise and knowledge here. So Jeff, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'll pass things over to you. You're muted, Jeff.
Classic. Okay. Thanks, Ben. Really appreciate it. Really thanks for the introduction, and yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today on a topic that I've been very excited about for my entire career. Ben mentioned I've been working on this stuff for quite a long time. My first EV project was started back in 2005. I was working on electric snowmobiles at McGill University, a very quaintly Canadian way to get into the EV space. But I can tell you it's been amazing to watch it turn from EVs being very much that kind of a science project to now something that is really a part of our day-to-day lives. Yeah, really quick acceleration across the market, but obviously a lot of still really important barriers to adoption of EVs, some of which are real and they're not myths. I think the goal here was to maybe talk about some of those things that are some of those barriers that are a little bit overblown, that may be exaggerated, and with a bit of discussion and knowledge sharing, I think some of these barriers might actually be less of a barrier than they might seem initially. So just quickly about the organization. If you're like me, when I applied for the job at Dunsky, I had no idea who Dunsky was. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a Canadian firm, headquartered in Montreal, offices in Toronto and Vancouver as well, and a few other colleagues spread out in different parts of the country. Been around for just under 20 years, and generally we support our clients in their efforts to accelerate the clean energy transition. And we do that through analysis and strategy. So a lot of modeling analysis, but tying all of that analysis through to concrete actions and helping our clients understand what they can do to accelerate this transition. And we have 4 focus areas. And I joined the firm 6.5 years ago to really lead up that second one there, all about mobility. But I have colleagues who are also experts in building energy efficiency and renewable energy and things like that. Generally speaking, we work a lot with governments and utilities, governments of all levels, everywhere from the federal government down to local and regional governments. A lot of work with utilities, trying to understand what, for example, transportation electrification means in terms of grid impacts, and also other organizations that are trying to figure out their role in the energy transition. So sometimes those are nonprofits, other times it's companies that are adopting EVs in their own fleets, or sometimes we work with the companies that are actually developing some of these solutions. A little bit more about our EV specific types of work. This can give you a feel of the types of things that I'm working on a day-to-day basis. So for example, we've done a lot of work with the Quebec government, helping them set their targets for EV adoption. And also more recently, a lot of work around determining how much charging infrastructure is needed across the province to enable adoption of EVs. We've also done a lot of work with electric utilities from coast to coast in just about every province, helping them forecast adoption of EVs and understand what does this mean for their grid? To what extent are these going to pose higher peak load impacts on the grid, and to what extent can they encourage off-peak charging, and in some cases even turn EVs into an overall net benefit to the grid by leveraging their flexibility in even using EVs as distributed energy resources through things like bidirectional charging or V2G. We've also done a lot of work at the municipal level. I mentioned that project with the City of Toronto. We developed their EV strategy. Similar projects with other cities across Canada, like Montreal, Vancouver, and smaller cities as well, like New Westminster, where I first met Ben, and Halifax, Victoria, and everything in between. So maybe I'll leave it there. Just the last thing I'll mention is also we've done a lot of work with the federal government. Federal government through both Transport Canada and Natural Resources Canada have been playing a pretty important role in enabling adoption of EVs, in particular with a focus on ensuring there's enough charging infrastructure out there. So we've supported NRCan in the development of the various funding programs that they've offered on this front, which are currently live and receiving applications for various types of charging infrastructure. So we help them set their targets and figure out how much of the federal budget they need to carve out to make sure they're keeping the ball moving forward on this front. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of the type of work that I'm doing day to day. But I think today for this presentation, I wanted to bring it a little bit more down to earth on the day-to-day realities of what it's like to consider adding an EV into your daily life. It's something that I did myself. I've been driving an EV, my own personal EV, since about 2018. But even before that, through work, I had the chance to drive EVs through just about every one of the jobs that I've had before this one. I would have access to fleet vehicles that I was able to take home and test drive and things like that. So pretty familiar with what it's like to actually work with these vehicles. And also in particular, all the types of concerns and questions that come up from either folks that I deal with on a daily basis through work, but also just in my personal life, friends and family that, 15 years ago when I was first starting on this stuff, they thought it was kind of weird that I was working on electric snowmobiles. Now it seems like my wife is pretty annoyed every time we get together with friends and family, and all they want to do is ask me questions about the latest EV developments, things like that. So anyway, these are all the questions that I wanted to tackle. More than happy to address any other concerns that you might have once we wrap up, but I figure this will really cover a lot of the most common questions that come up. So first of all, how far can you go with an electric vehicle? That's probably one of the number one questions that comes up in my mind. And first thing to understand is that when I talk about EVs, there really are two different types of EVs. And that includes fully electric, battery electric vehicles, as they're sometimes called. And those are vehicles that have a battery and electric motor, you plug them in to charge. And they might have a range of, say, 350 to 600 kilometers of range, depending on the model, depending on driving conditions. And that's pretty straightforward. I'd say the second category of EV is a little bit less well understood. And that might be because there's actually, a third type of vehicle that I haven't mentioned here. Those are conventional hybrid vehicles, like what we first saw with the Toyota Prius back in the late 90s. But to contrast with regular hybrids, plug-in hybrids take that kind of approach, add a much bigger battery, and add the ability to charge up that battery overnight. Regular hybrids, you can't plug them in, and so the only source of energy for those vehicles is really the gas in the tank, and they just use a battery and electric motor to make more efficient use of that gasoline. Whereas plug-in hybrids, the idea here is that you can plug them in overnight, and they'll typically have enough electric range to cover most daily driving needs. So something on the order of 40 to 80 kilometers of electric range. And once that's used up, you have a gas engine that'll turn on automatically, and it'll allow you to cover longer distances without any planning around charging. And you can just simply use a gas station like you would with a regular car. So as you can see, with a plug-in hybrid, driving range and charging really isn't a limitation. You can really treat it like a regular car, and you just get all the benefits of an electric car for your day-to-day driving. Whereas with battery electric vehicles, yeah, once that range is used up, you need to get to a charge station. So that's where that concern about range limitations and charging availability become much more important. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like, those range capabilities relative to the infrastructure that we have out there today in a few slides. But first of all, in terms of the types of charging infrastructure that we have, we generally break them into 3 categories, and that's AC level 1 and 2, and then DC fast charging, which is sometimes called level 3. For AC charging, you're really providing household electricity to the vehicle, and that can be either 120 volts, like from a standard outlet in the case of level 1, or 240 volts for level 2, which is typically what say an electric oven or dryer would use. So every house in Canada would have 240 volts available from the electrical panel. And you can see, I've provided some estimates of what you can do with that power. So level 1 is interesting. It's pretty limited, but it's pretty flexible because you can get that just about anywhere. And that would be enough for some people to do their charging. If they're really just covering short daily driving distances, that might be sufficient, because you can get about 60 kilometers of range while plugging in overnight. But most people that are doing a significant amount of driving, they feel much more comfortable having a level 2 charging station installed at home. That's what I have in my house. And that's what will get you a 400-kilometer charge overnight, or maybe even more, depending on the power level. So that's really pretty flexible. You could basically do a full day-long trip every day and come back overnight and be ready for the next trip in the morning. And this is also the type of charging station that's quite common at workplaces and even in public locations as well. But as you can tell, 400 kilometers overnight, that's not really going to help you much on a road trip unless you're stopping at a hotel. If you need something that'll top you up on a longer trip and you need to go more than the range of your electric vehicle, that's where you really need to use a DC fast charger. And this is the type of thing that, generally speaking, it'll give you a charge in about half an hour. That it'll range depending on the power level and the power capabilities of your vehicle and the charger. But this is really the kind of thing where you might be able to drive 300 or 400 kilometers, stop for a lunch break, charge up while you're taking a break and stretching your legs, and get back on the road. And this is the type of infrastructure that's really popped up all over North America over the past 10 years. It's been really fun to watch that infrastructure grow. When I used to work for BC Hydro out on the West Coast, and this map right here was very sparse. This is a map of all the DC fast chargers in North America. And back in 2012, when I started BC Hydro, we were working on putting in the first 30 of these chargers back then. And so that's basically all there was. Now we're at a point where I know a lot of people who have driven from coast to coast in an EV. You can see, in the prairies, it might take a little bit of planning because there's not as much, they're not quite as dense, but it's absolutely feasible to drive from coast to coast in an EV relying on those fast chargers. And that's been really amazing to watch as I've worked with Enercan since 2017, as they've provided a lot of the funding that has helped make this happen. So every one of these dots is the kind of charger that'll charge up a car in about half an hour. So that really opens up a lot of doors. I thought I'd zoom in a little bit on your region to give a feel for what that looks like locally. And you can see there's definitely a lot of variability from province to province. You can see that Quebec, for example, they've got a very dense network of charging infrastructure. Their electric utility, Hydro-Quebec, has been deploying this infrastructure since 2012, and they've really had a mandate from the government to go ahead and do that and just do what needs to be done to enable EV adoption. Ontario is a bit more of a complex market, and many different utilities in the ecosystem. And we're now starting to see some pretty coordinated effort from folks like Ivy, which is a joint collaboration between Hydro One and OPG. But even at that, it's a pretty comprehensive network. You can get just about anywhere in the province. And to put this map in perspective, I thought it'd be helpful just to put a circle on the map that represents the typical driving range. I drew a circle about 400 kilometers centered around Parry Sound. And so this can really give you a sense of, you can get pretty far before you even need to stop at your first charger if you're going on a really long trip. And the spacing between these chargers is pretty good, such that you don't need to stop at every charger. You can probably make it out to Sault Ste. Marie, for example, and your next stop might not be until pretty close to Thunder Bay. Now that said, that's the range capability of an EV in good weather. I'll talk in a few slides about how in cold weather range reduces significantly, and so that's why it's nice to have a little bit more of a dense spacing of chargers. I'd also say that with the spacing that we have now in Ontario, there still has to be a little bit of planning. You have to sort of look at the map before you set out and anticipate where you're going to need to pull over and sort of plan your stops around that. I'd say that in Quebec, they've gotten to the point now where you can basically just set out on your drive and just pull into the next charger whenever you need to charge. And there's probably going to be one pretty close by. So that density really has an impact on the convenience. But I think we're seeing pretty rapid growth in Ontario as well. And the last thing I'll say on this slide is just to keep in mind that since you can charge at home, and this is just my charger here. I live on a farm in Quebec, and this is a charger that just installed on the side of my barn. When you start every day with a full charge, because you can just plug in overnight, this is what you're starting with every day. You can leave your house and get way out away from home pretty easily without even worrying about charging. And I think from that perspective, I find EV ownership almost more convenient than a gas car, where when I was commuting on a daily basis in a gas car before we had our EV, I'd have to, make the detour to the gas station on a weekly basis. For me, on my day-to-day use of an EV, I never have to use a public charger. And it's probably been about 4 or 5 months since the last time I actually needed a public charger. So that's something to keep in mind. But not to diminish the fact that these dots really have to be there on the map to reassure folks that they can switch to an EV and get where they need to go, even if it is just a once in a while long distance trip. So I'll move on now just to talk about cost, because I know that that was one of the top questions, just in terms of how expensive EVs are. And I wanted to bring that closer to home with an example that's a really, down-to-earth vehicle. This is what I drive, a Chevy Bolt down at the bottom. I know that it's recently been announced that they're going to stop producing the Bolt. Even more recently, they just hinted that they may have a new version of the Bolt coming out in a few years, but it's probably the most basic EV out there. There are a few cheaper ones than this that have a bit less range, but for me, it's a really useful benchmark for comparison. And I'm comparing that with the Toyota Corolla hatchback, so one of the most common hatchbacks that's out there. And you can see in terms of the starting price, $26,000 for the Toyota Corolla, $41,000 for the Chevy Bolt as the starting price. But that's before financial incentives. So across Canada right now, there's a $5,000 rebate available from the federal government, and that really helps address that upfront cost in a significant way. Other provinces like Quebec and BC, Nova Scotia, even Yukon have additional incentives at the provincial level or territorial level. Unfortunately, Ontario did have a pretty generous incentive, but that was canceled a few years back. So right now in Ontario, the federal rebate is all you have to work with. I also just mentioned, I'm a bit of a gearhead, but I'm also mentioning the power level here and the acceleration, just to give you a sense of, it can be kind of hard to get a apples to apples comparison on these types of vehicles. And just to highlight that, this little hatchback that you get with the Chevy Bolt, it is quite a quick little car. The performance is pretty much on par with the Volkswagen Golf GTI. So it's significantly more performing than in terms of acceleration and speed and things like that than the hatchback. But that might not be what's motivating us right now. Let's focus on fuel savings, because while the EV costs more upfront to buy, the operating costs are significantly lower. And I find it surprising to me that even, I went to engineering school. I find I have engineering friends who are very literate in all things energy costs and calculations like that. And even they're surprised when I tell them how cheap it is to run an EV. And so I give out an example here. The Corolla is a relatively fuel efficient vehicle at 6.8 liters per 100 kilometer. But if you assume about 30,000 kilometers a year, which I think is pretty reasonable for a rural area, that works out to just under $3,000 a year in fuel. And add that up over 8 years, and you're talking over $20,000, which is really significant compared to the upfront purchase price of the vehicle. Contrast that with an EV, and this is the energy consumption of a Bolt. Other even vehicles like larger vehicles have consumption of around that level. The electricity cost, of course, is a complex topic in Ontario, and there's talk right now of ultra low electricity rates. And so depending on when you charge, the cost might vary. I just chose a number that's fairly representative of typical usage if you are doing a good job of following your time of use rates. And that adds up to about $420 a year in electricity. So over the life of a vehicle, over 8 or 10 years, you're talking about something on the order of $20,000 of savings. And that can really end up being the cheapest option when you look at a total cost of ownership basis. And so that's really important to keep in mind. This is only going to continue to be the case over time because EVs are getting cheaper as well. When we first started seeing production EVs coming to market in the early 2010s, the only vehicle that offered, the 400 kilometers of range that you get from a Chevy Bolt cost easily $80,000 or $90,000. So now we have a number of long-range EV options that are down in this sort of $40,000 to $50,000 range. Still sounds like a bit of a high upfront price for a small car, but when you factor in that cost of operations, it can really end up being the most affordable option. Also, I'll just add that a really nice thing about EVs is that they have much less maintenance than a gas vehicle. There are no oil changes to make. The brake maintenance is much lower just because you don't actually need to use the brakes that often. EVs can do what's called regenerative braking, which means slowing down by using the electric motor as a generator and recharging the battery instead of using the friction brakes. And so maintenance costs typically are maybe about half or 40% less than a typical gas car. And and it is also in the long term, there's just a lot fewer systems that can break. So that's a really nice perk of EV ownership. Now, I've just given you some examples of little small hatchbacks. And some people think that those are the only options for EVs, because that certainly is what we started with. Things like the Nissan Leaf, the Chevy Bolt that I just showed here, Volkswagen Golf, Ford Focus EV, a lot of small hatchbacks for the first little while in the EV market, but that is no longer the case. And I'm just gonna flood you with a whole bunch of examples of electric SUVs and crossovers that have hit the market. You can see all sorts of different brands, Jeeps and Hyundais and Fords and just about everything under the sun. Every manufacturer now, more or less, has some kind of an electric SUV, whether it's high-end luxury vehicles like these Lincolns and Mercedes, or more down-to-earth vehicles like Mitsubishis and Nissans. It goes on and on and on. It's kind of ridiculous. No, EVs are not just small hatchbacks. Now you can really get larger options, vehicles with four-wheel drive, more storage space, and so that's really opening a lot of doors. Besides SUVs, pickup trucks are also a really important segment. Overall, SUVs have higher sales collectively than pickup trucks, but the top selling models in the market are all pickup trucks, just because there's only a few models on the market. And it kind of started with the F-150, but we're now at a point where all of the big three American automakers that really dominate the truck market, they all have EV options. In the case of the Ford, already on the market, we're starting to see them on the road day to day here in Canada. But both GM with the Chevy and GMC brands and Ram have electric truck options that are coming out in the next year or two. The F-150 really took the market by storm. It's the most popular vehicle. The gas version is the most best-selling vehicle in Canada and the US for something like 40 years straight. So having an electric option of that vehicle is really opening a lot of doors. And that includes not just with personal vehicle owners, but also with fleets. This is definitely a workhorse vehicle that is a really important part of a lot of government, municipal fleets out there and company fleets. What I was really shocked about was how affordable these truck options are. And actually it's varied. The F-150, when it first launched, it was announced with a $40,000 US price, which really, my jaw literally dropped when I saw that price, because it was a lot lower than what we had initially been forecasting. They've since actually raised that price just because demand has been through the roof. They've been scrambling to accelerate production as quickly as they can, and in parallel, they've actually jacked that price up somewhat to try to cool off demand a little bit, maybe make a little bit more money off those things. But you can see the specs that are listed for all these vehicles are really quite something. You know, at least 500 kilometers of range, up to all the way up to 800 kilometers of range for the Ram. The Ram is the first vehicle where they've said there will be a plug-in hybrid version as well. So it'll have some form of a gas or diesel engine that can actually help it cover longer distances. But really incredible power output on these vehicles. They're the most powerful versions of these pickup trucks, more powerful than their gas counterparts, and they can tow a pretty significant amount. That said, you know, I'd say under towing conditions, we've seen that the range of these vehicles takes a hit as it would with a gas-powered vehicle. So I think that's why it's interesting that Ram is proposing a plug-in hybrid version of their truck as well, which might help for those long towing trips. And it's not just the Detroit Big Three. Tesla, Rivian, Hummer, and have also put trucks out there. The Rivian is already on sale. The Tesla Cybertruck, which is that cartoonish looking angular one up there, should be on the market sometime in the next few months or so. And even things like cargo vans, like the Ford Transit, is now available as a fully electric version as well, which is really great for some of those urban delivery applications. And just I'll end the flood of photos of example EVs, but with some very large trucks. So it's not just personal light duty vehicles, but also all the way up to Class 8 semi-trucks. Every one of the major manufacturers of semi-trucks, you know, we see these Freightliners and Volvo trucks on the road on a daily basis. They're all coming out with their electric options and actively selling these. There are some of these on the road currently in Canada and a bunch in the US as well. I actually have an interesting application just down the road from me. I live next to an open air zoo, and they have an electric safari truck. That's my little boy Gabriel, who was very happy to come with me to the launch of these trucks. And this is a Lion Electric, so a company that really is famous for building electric school buses. They also make several different models of Class 5, Class 6, and this is a Class 8 truck, fully electric. And so pretty excited to see some manufacturing of these large vehicles here in Canada as well. So next question, what if the power goes out? So clearly, fully electric vehicles, this is a concern, because if you're relying on the grid to power these vehicles, what do you do if there's an outage? Not as much of an issue for plug-in hybrid. I'd say plug-in hybrid is probably the most resilient option out there, because you will have the gas in the tank if you need it. But for a pure electric vehicle, I'd argue that you're actually in a pretty good position with a fully electric vehicle, because thanks to that overnight charging at home, you really start each day with about 400 kilometers in the tank. And so if the power goes out, you probably have enough for several days of driving with 400 kilometers in the tank. Contrast that with a gas vehicle, and in my experience, you know, I might fuel up whenever I get down to about a quarter tank. And it's a bit of a Russian roulette in terms of, if the power goes out, how much gas will I have in the tank? And if my gas station is out of power on the day when I'm down to a quarter tank, and I need to fill up, that might actually be even more problematic. So, you know, it's there's pluses and minuses to each approach. And I'd say there's different kinds of risk depending on the duration of the outage. But, you know, for the most common types of outages that we have of a few hours, maybe a day, it's probably very likely that you're going to have a lot of range in your vehicle. It's more than enough for your daily use. On top of that, there are public chargers that you can use as a fallback. Every EV driver will download an app on their phone that can guide them to their nearest charger. And when you look back at that map of how many chargers are out there, it's a pretty good chance that you could find a nearby charger that has power. These apps will show live status on these chargers and tell you which ones are online. And that's definitely not something that I've seen for gas stations. I don't know of the app that tells you what gas stations are out of power. So it certainly is, you know, a limitation that you have to keep in mind. But as an EV driver in a rural area where the power does go out on occasion, I've never had a challenge using my EV. I've never actually had to fall back on using. We do still have a gas car. It sits around and gets used maybe once a month when we need more than one car at a time. But we've never had a situation where the power went out and we resorted back to our gas vehicle for these reasons. Now, on top of that, EVs actually present some interesting opportunities in power outages. And one thing that I have done is power this kind of a webinar. My wife teaches online, and we actually powered her computer and our Wi-Fi from our EV during a power failure when she was giving an online course. So I'm on grid power now, not relying on my vehicle as we speak, but this is increasingly an option. I was able to do that. You know, I've got an engineering background. I was able to figure out a setup that could work for us using inverters from Canadian Tire and some extension cords. But increasingly, we're seeing vehicles that have that kind of an inverter that's built into the vehicle, including this F-150, which has a total of 11 outlets, both some in the bed, in the pickup bed, and some under the front here. You can see that since there's no engine on that vehicle, underneath the hood, there's just a wide open cargo space, and that cargo space also has a number of outlets, and that includes not just 120-volt standard outlets, but even you can see in that photo the person is plugging a 240-volt appliance in there. That might be something like a welder or some really high power equipment. So that's really interesting. It's interesting for construction workers who might need remote power on a site and can use this EV to avoid having to lug a generator on site. But it could also be really interesting for those outage scenarios. There's actually two options. One would be to plug in through these outlets, but they also have a more integrated option where the charge station itself becomes bidirectional, and you can integrate that into the panel in your home with a typical transfer switch to make sure that you're powering your home safely without energizing the lines outside your home, as you need to do with a standard gas-powered generator. But overall, what's really amazing is to think about how much energy is stored in the battery of an EV. The F-150 has somewhere around 100 to 130 kilowatt hours of storage. And that could honestly power, if you're just really limiting it to essential loads, like keeping your fridge running, your Wi-Fi, charging phones and lights, you could keep that running for weeks. And if you wanted to do the full home backup power, you could probably keep your lights, your full house running for a couple days anyways, depending on what kind of loads you're using. So that's really a compelling option with these EVs and the flexibility that you just don't get with the gas powered vehicle. I found there was a really interesting demonstration that Hyundai's been doing where they're powering a reindeer ranch up in northern Norway. So that's pretty special, but pretty exciting. And this is a feature that we're seeing integrated into more and more of the EVs that are coming to market. Now, that's a good segue with the photo of the reindeers to talk about cold weather performance. And so, yes, EVs do lose a significant amount of range in cold weather. And it can be as much as a 50% drop on those very coldest days. So, you know, if we're down around -20, -30, you could see, you know, if a vehicle has 400 kilometers of range, you might see it as low as 200 kilometers on those coldest days. More average winter days, I'd say the loss is more in the range of 25 to 40%. I've shared a graph here from the folks at Geotab, which sort of shows what they've measured from real data from EVs out on the road in terms of how much range a vehicle gets compared to their average, their rated performance. I'd say this is also something that's improving over time. Some of the older EVs on the market had less efficient heating systems, and more recent EVs are doing much better in cold weather, thanks to things like heat pumps, which are integrated into the EV. But all that said, it definitely is something that you have to take into account. EV drivers get accustomed to this. They know that in wintertime, if they are planning on a long trip, they're going to need to plan on more frequent charging stops. Although really, if you're really focused on the day-to-day use around town, you're still going to be well within the reach of your daily driving range, even in cold temperatures. I would say that there are a few benefits for EVs in the cold. And first and foremost, they always start. When you compare it to a gas or a diesel engine, where on a cold day, you need this tiny little 12-volt battery to turn over a cold engine that has thick oil that's making it pretty sluggish to turn over. In my experience, most gas vehicle owners have experienced those days where they've had to boost start their vehicle. That never happens with an EV, because when you turn on an EV, there's no engine that you need to fire up to get started. It's really just closing a switch and that vehicle is ready to go. On top of that, these vehicles all have a preheating feature where you can actually get the car to warm up while it's still plugged into the grid. So while it's connected to your charger, you can tell it to start warming up. That gets your vehicle nice and cozy for you. And it's interesting because to me, this is something you can do with a gas car. It's a bit of a guilty pleasure with a gas car because you're burning extra gas with a car sitting there running just to warm up. And you might even run your heated seats and steering wheel, which burns even more gas, despite the fact that you have a bunch of free heat coming off of the engine. So those are sort of guilty pleasures to address the cold weathers in a gas car. Both of those guilty pleasures, heated seats, steering wheels, preheating, those are all things that just make more efficient use of the energy in your vehicle and maximize your range, all while really having some nice perks in terms of that direct contact comfort. Now, I'll start to wrap this up. And I think one of the questions that we often see is, are EVs really green? And there are questions around, where does the electricity come from and where does the, and how are the vehicles made? First, I'll just add that, the greenest option for transportation is always not driving. If you can get where you need to go by transit or walking or cycling, those will always be the best options, more efficient than moving an entire vehicle just for your own needs. Even better than that is if you can avoid the trip altogether. But if a vehicle is needed to get where you need to go, EVs really are the best option. And that includes when looking at a full life cycle analysis. So cradle to grave, including all the energy that goes into making that vehicle and disposing the vehicle at the end of its life. This is a topic that I've been researching for about 15 years now. And we come to the same conclusion every time that even when you account for those manufacturing emissions, the emissions savings during the usage phase of the vehicle are so strong that they way more than make up for any kind of additional emissions associated with the manufacturing stage. So, sorry, I meant for these graphs to come on one at a time to take a look, but I'll just explain what we're looking at here. This is from a tool that I really like. It's called carboncounter.com. And apologies if I didn't put the link there, but it's a pretty easy URL to remember. Oh yeah, it's right there, carboncounter.com. They integrate vehicle life cycle and emissions data from the US Department of Energy to calculate the total greenhouse gas emissions on a per kilometer basis for different vehicle types. So in black and gray, you have gasoline and diesel vehicles. The light pink are regular hybrids that don't plug in. And then the dark pink or red, those are plug-in hybrids. Yellow vehicles are battery electric vehicles, and blue, those are hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And you can see that even on the US average grid, so this tool is taking into account how is electricity generated in the US. There's some coal, some natural gas, some nuclear, and more recently, and hydro, and more recently, a lot of wind and solar. Even in the average US grid, you can see that EVs are pretty consistently the lowest emissions option on a life cycle basis. And it only gets better when we look to Canada. And Ontario's grid, there's a little bit of natural gas left that we use on occasion, but predominantly the grid in Ontario is nuclear, hydro, and increasingly some wind and solar. And in that context, EVs are by far, less than a quarter of the emissions of a comparable gas-powered vehicle, even when accounting for those manufacturing emissions. So that's pretty significant. There are other questions in terms of how do we get the materials. There's more to environmental impacts than just greenhouse gas emissions. Some of those things get a little bit harder to compare on the same basis. But I'd say that there's a lot of efforts. In fact, just today, the EU announced new measures to track the impacts of mining activities for electric vehicle batteries and make sure that we're making improvements in terms of environmental and human impacts for our mining activities and moving towards more streamlined and healthy supply chains for these batteries over time. And it's also really helpful to remind ourselves that transportation in many parts of Canada, including in Ontario, transportation is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions, especially in Ontario, thanks to the fact that Ontario has made huge strides on decarbonizing the electricity system. Transportation is really the standout here in terms of the #1 source of emissions. So it's absolutely critical that we tackle those emissions from the transportation sector, and shifting that energy demand to an increasingly decarbonized grid is really an essential step of tackling emissions from the transportation sector in parallel to efforts to reduce use of cars altogether and shift to more efficient modes. In terms of transportation emissions, it's a pretty even split between passenger vehicles like cars and trucks and SUVs, and those heavier duty trucks that are used to transport our goods around the country. So it's yeah, it's pretty important for us to all think about the vehicles that we are all putting on our own driveways, because that is a really significant portion of the emissions in the country. And finally, just to end on a fun note, I think it's really important for folks to understand what it's like to drive an EV. And honestly, they are so much fun to drive. I've just put one example here. This is a drag racing Mustang that Ford has put together that's 100% electric. They're surprisingly fast. And that's because the electric motors have maximum torque at 0 RPM, where as opposed to like a gas engine where you really need to rev it up before it really starts to push. And there's also no shifting. It's just constant acceleration. You put your foot down and it just surges forward without any pause in the acceleration. It's very linear throttle response, really nice and easy to control. And a lot of EV drivers really enjoy the fact that you can do what's called one pedal driving. And that's where you sort of adjust the settings. A lot of EVs have the option to increase regenerative braking whenever you lift off the pedal. It takes a bit of getting used to, but it means that you can avoid pressing on the friction brakes and do all your braking with just regenerative braking, where it's just charging the vehicle. And honestly, in stop and go traffic, it's a lot nicer to just do that with one pedal rather than having to shift back and forth. Maybe it sounds like I'm being a little bit lazy, but I find it can get pretty tedious in a traffic jam to keep switching from brakes to throttle as traffic stops and starts. So if you haven't already, definitely go and try one. So any local dealership, if they don't have an EV on display, you should bug them to get one so that you can try one. And there are also other organizations in Ontario that are doing really good work on providing opportunities for folks to learn about EVs. So there's folks like the EV Society, which is Canada-wide, but they have a strong presence in Ontario, and they also have links to a lot of local EV groups and lots of great info online, including a webinar series that's really, really worth checking out on their events calendar. And there's also the folks at Plug and Drive who put a lot of focus on enabling test drives. I think they've realized that probably the #1 way to convince somebody to switch to an EV is to actually try one, because they're just so good to drive. I mentioned that we still have a gas car, but my wife and I fight anytime that we actually both need to be somewhere. Today was actually I had to go get some antibiotics for my son, and my wife was away with our EV. So it was my first time driving our gas car in about a month. And oh boy, it's a different experience, really not nearly as pleasant. So Plug and Drive, they really do some great work on enabling test drive events. And they're even doing that increasingly with sort of a traveling test drive trailer that they bring around to different events. On top of that, their website is full of information about EVs, and including a full list of all the EV models that are available in Canada. So really a lot of great resources at your disposal. And yeah, I really encourage you to go check out these organizations if you want more information. But anyway, I'll stop there. I'm really eager to hear if there are any questions from the audience, because if I haven't covered something that you're really curious about, more than happy to dive into any other topics.
Thank you, Jeff. You covered a lot of topics there. We really appreciate that. And just a note to everyone as well, too, that Plug and Drive will actually be in Parry Sound at the Stocky Center on August 19th, and we'll be offering that test drive service. So to Jeff's point about getting that opportunity to get that firsthand experience, that will be available on August 19th. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the question and answer tool, and Jeff can field those. But Jeff, I do have one question here as well too. It's connects back to the poll that we had at the start, and wondering if you could maybe just talk for a couple of minutes about the concern that some people had about the grid impacts, for example, that EVs have.
Yeah, sure. And apologies for not really covering that in this presentation, but it's something that I've worked on a lot over my career. And in fact, just earlier today, I was working on analysis for different grids across Canada on exactly what do these vehicles mean for the grid. I'll just go back, because I think the slide where I just talked about some of the projects that we do gives you a sense of where we've been doing that kind of analysis. Honestly, I would say that the biggest challenge for me in my work, I've done a lot of work on testing out and demonstrating solutions that can minimize the impact of EVs on the grid. And the greatest challenge for me in that work has been that the urgency just isn't there. And a lot of utilities that I've spoken to have said, you know what, that's great. We'll get there someday. We don't really need it yet because right now the amount of load introduced by EVs is like, it's kind of significant, but it's really going to be a few years before they really start to feel any pain on that front. But yeah, so we've done a lot of work for utilities in just about every province to actually quantify that additional load. So developing forecasts of how many EVs we expect to be adopted over time, when those vehicles charge, how much power they pull. And in fact, we're conducting an analysis right now for the NRCan, National Resources Canada, to assess the overall grid readiness from coast to coast for EVs. And I'd say, you know, there's definitely going to be work to do. It's not to say that we can fully electrify all the vehicles today and we'll be fine. That would cause problems. I'd say what's working in our favor on this front is also one of the challenges in terms of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, is that it takes a long time to turn over the fleet. The average vehicle stays on the road for maybe 15 or more years. So even if you were to switch such that everybody's buying a new vehicle today was buying an electric vehicle, it would still take 15 years before all the vehicles on the road is electric. And you know, the target that the federal government has set, we're not going to hit that 100% of new sales until 2035. So utilities do really have a lot of time to prepare for this load growth. One of the opportunities is to encourage off-peak charging. And there are a number of ways you can do this, simply with a rate structure like what's being proposed in Ontario, where with enough communication and education, folks will realize that it's in their interest to either use their vehicle or their charger to schedule charging to start when the electricity is cheaper. Or there's more advanced integration options where vehicles or chargers can respond directly to signals coming from the utility that might say, hey, we're having a peak event on this day because we anticipate there's going to be a lot of heating demand or air conditioning demand. And EVs can then become a really valuable asset to those utilities by shifting when they charge. One thing I'll say is that when we've done analysis on this and tried to quantify the cost of this additional peak load, we've actually found that EVs can present a net benefit to the grid. If EVs are consuming electricity when off-peak, when the grid has excess capacity, they're actually sending more money to the electricity system. Those EV drivers are paying higher utility bills that is more than offsetting the cost of any additional load growth. So they're really helping all of us collectively make better use of the grid that we've all invested in collectively. So I think a lot of utilities across Canada they're not worried that the grid is going to collapse. They might see some work that they need to do to expand capacity in a few spots, but overall, they're seeing EVs as an opportunity for the grid that's flexible and going to lead to what they refer to as overall beneficial load growth.
It's very encouraging to hear. Yeah, if there's any further questions as well, too, please put them in the question and answer tool. I don't see any at the moment, but we'll give it 30 seconds, a minute here.
Sure. Maybe I'll ask you, Ben, have you tried any EVs, and what EVs have you tried?
I have tried a couple myself. I've tried the Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrid. It performed great. And like you said, it's just a learning curve to understand the regenerative braking. But once you get the feel for it, it's a lot of fun to drive, and it performs really, really well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, it's a great little SUV that we do a lot of work with fleets as well, municipal fleets, and we've seen a lot of fleets really grab onto that vehicle because it's versatile. It's got enough size for a lot of purposes in different fleets, and it has that flexibility of switching over to gas whenever you need to go on a longer drive.
That's exactly the reason that this person had purchased that one was having that stepping into the market and getting comfortable with the technology before moving over to a fully electric BEV. We do have one question here. What happens to the batteries as they deplete?
So I'm assuming that means like at the end of the life of the battery. as opposed to, because not when you drain your battery, you need to plug it in, but rather 10, 15 years down the road, what happens with a dead battery? So yeah, that's been a key question from early on in the EV transition. And so I'd say most automakers at this point are getting to a point where they feel confident in asserting that their batteries are designed to last the life of the vehicle. And that's certainly what, it's hard to say because there are only so many EVs that have been on the road for long enough to really see what happens at the end of their life. But we are starting to see examples of Teslas, for example, that are hitting 400, 500,000 kilometers on the odometer on their original battery. They might have, say, a 10 or 20% reduction in their range at that point. So you might need to charge more frequently. But generally speaking, those batteries should last as long enough for the other things on the car to start failing, the bodywork to start rusting out, and generally being a sign that it's due for the car to go into the recycling process. So I'll talk about recycling in a minute. There have been some EVs, some early models like the Nissan Leaf, unfortunately. It was really an early pioneer on this front, but Nissan sort of pushed the limit on what they could do without a liquid cooling system. Most EVs today have a system of coolant that runs through the battery to keep it at an ideal temperature. Nissan on their first generation Leaf skipped out on that, and I think they sort of paid the price, and we've seen that vehicle out of any EV on the market probably has had the most problems with batteries that actually need to be replaced before the vehicle is done. So that's unfortunate for the folks that switched to that vehicle. I have some friends that are in that situation, but it doesn't seem to be a challenge with modern EVs today. Now, in terms of what happens with those batteries once they're done, I mean, we've got a really good system of recycling old gas vehicles. There's a lot of useful metal in those vehicles and a pretty good system to streamline that process of recovering those metals. And it's the same thing for EVs. It's a little bit more complicated. Those batteries are complex. There's a lot of materials in there, but those materials are extremely valuable. And it's much easier to get those materials out of a pile of used batteries than to go and fetch those materials out of the ground. So we are seeing some really promising developments in terms of battery recycling, including two of the global leaders in battery recycling are actually based in Canada. One based in Ontario called Li-Cycle, and one in Quebec called Lithion. And they're both establishing agreements with major automakers to actually collect those batteries, as we are now just starting to see some of those 10-year-old, 15-year-old EVs reaching the end of their life, especially those that are used as like Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, things like that. Those companies are streamlining the processes for actually recovering those batteries and turning them into fresh battery materials to put back into the supply chain. So really promising developments on that front as well. One other thing I'll mention, though, that there is some promising opportunities for potentially using those batteries before you even bother recycling them. Some EV batteries may even still have enough life left in them that it'd be worth using them for some kind of a second life application. So we have seen a number of projects where they've taken used EV batteries that, they might only have 80% of their original capacity. That might be limiting for somebody that wants to have good range in their EV, but that will still be more than enough capacity to serve some kind of a stationary application, like providing backup power for a building or providing grid services as well. So that means sort of supporting the electric grid with a stationary storage system. But I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jeff. Well, I don't want to take any more of your time and let you enjoy the rest of your evening. So I want to conclude by saying thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Thank you, Jeff, for sharing all of your incredible knowledge and expertise with us today. Speaking for myself, I learned a lot, and I hope everybody here tonight did as well. So thanks, Jeff, and thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It was really fun to speak with you all.
Thank you.
Take care.